Claire rushed out of the house, her trembling hands clutching her woolen shawl. The cold winter wind sliced through the valley, howling like a restless ghost. Each step she took felt heavier, yet her resolve was unshaken. She had to reach the barn. The faint glow of a lantern, swaying in the biting wind, served as her only guide through the dense darkness. When she reached the barn door, her heart pounded in her chest, a drumbeat of anxiety and anticipation. The soft sound of hooves shifting echoed from inside, as though the horse within was waiting for her, sensing her approach. She placed her palm against the rough wood of the door, pushing it open with a creak that tore through the silent night. Inside, Victor stood tall, his coat gleaming under the dim light. His jet-black eyes locked onto hers with a gaze so deep, it felt as though he could see every secret she had buried in her heart. Claire took a hesitant step forward, her breath hitching as the heavy air of the barn seemed to wrap around her like an invisible shroud. "You knew I'd come, didn't you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The horse tilted his head, a small gesture that felt like an acknowledgement. There was something in his gaze, a quiet understanding, a connection that words could never capture. For a fleeting moment, Claire felt seen, truly seen, in a way she hadn't in years. As she reached out, her fingers brushed against Victor's mane. Warmth radiated from him, seeping into her cold, trembling hands. It was an electrifying sensation, a current that traveled down her spine. She closed her eyes, the weight of her loneliness crashing over her like a tidal wave. Outside, the wind howled, but Claire no longer noticed. There was only Victor and the secret that began to bloom between them, a secret both fragile and dangerous, threading itself into the shadows of the barn. For years, Claire had carried an ache in her heart, a yearning for something she couldn't even name. Her marriage to Mark had started with such fiery passion, a love that seemed invincible. She remembered the laughter, the long nights by the fireplace, and the dreams they shared of a life filled with joy. But those days felt like a distant memory now. Mark, once her partner in everything, had become a ghost in their home. His career consumed him, pulling him away on endless business trips and late-night meetings. Each time he returned, it was as if a stranger walked through the door, polite, distracted, and unreachable. Claire had tried to bridge the growing distance between them. She planned romantic dinners, whispered words of encouragement, and waited patiently for the man she loved to return to her. But Mark's weary refrain was always the same: "I'm too tired, Claire. We'll talk later." But later never came. When Mark had brought Victor home, Claire thought it was another fleeting whim, a distraction for him to pour his energy into. Instead, the horse had become her solace. Victor, with his quiet strength and soulful eyes, offered a peace that Claire hadn't felt in years. He became her confidant, her escape from the cold emptiness of her marriage. Claire ran her hand along Victor's mane, her voice trembling as she whispered, "Sometimes I wish I could be like you, free, unburdened by all of this." The horse didn't respond, of course, but his gaze remained steady, as if he understood. In his presence, Claire found a fleeting sense of relief, but deep down, she knew her life was changing in ways she couldn't ignore. The barn became her refuge. Each night, as the moon cast its silvery glow over the fields, Claire would find herself drawn there, seeking comfort in Victor's silent company. But as the nights stretched into weeks, the line between solace and something deeper began to blur. One evening, as Claire stood beside Victor, brushing his coat and murmuring her thoughts into the quiet air, a voice broke through the stillness. "Claire," a woman called from the barn entrance, her tone calm but firm. Claire froze, her heart lurching in her chest. She turned to see Evelyn, the horse trainer Mark had hired. Evelyn's sharp eyes bore into her, piercing through every facade. "What are you doing here so late?" Evelyn's voice was steady, but there was an edge to it that Claire couldn't ignore. Claire stammered, I couldn't sleep. I just wanted to check on Victor." Evelyn stepped closer, her gaze unrelenting. You think he's the one who needs you? Or is it the other way around? The words hit Claire like a jolt, cutting through the haze of emotions she had been drowning in. She looked away, unable to meet Evelyn's piercing stare. But Evelyn wasn't finished. Horses like Victor, Evelyn said, her voice softer now, they sense things. Things we hide from ourselves. She paused, letting the words sink in before adding, "You're lonely, Claire. And loneliness has a way of leading us down paths we never thought we'd take." Claire's throat tightened. Evelyn's words echoed in her mind long after the woman left the barn. In Victor's eyes, she saw the unspoken truths she had been avoiding. But could she face them? Could she confront the storm brewing inside her before it consumed her completely? The days dragged on, but Claire couldn't shake Evelyn's words. They replayed in her mind like a haunting refrain, pushing her to confront feelings she had tried so hard to bury. Every glance at Victor, every gentle brush of his mane, reminded her of the quiet solace he offered, and the storm of emotions that lay just beneath the surface. Mark had returned home from yet another business trip, his presence barely more than a passing shadow. The usual routine unfolded. He dropped his suitcase by the door, muttered a distracted "Hey, how was your week?" and disappeared into his office. Claire stood in the kitchen, staring at the unfinished dinner she had prepared, her chest tight with frustration and sadness. That night, as she lay in bed beside Mark, the silence was deafening. He scrolled through his phone, his face illuminated by the cold blue glow of the screen. Claire turned on her side, the weight of his indifference pressing down on her like a heavy blanket. She wanted to scream, to shake him, to tell him that she was drowning in the emptiness their marriage had become. But the words caught in her throat, tangled in her fear of rejection and the aching hope that maybe, just maybe, he would notice her again. When the first rays of dawn broke through the curtains, Claire found herself drawn to the barn. It had become a ritual, a quiet escape from the hollow routine of her days. As she opened the heavy wooden door, the familiar scent of hay and earth greeted her, grounding her in a way nothing else could. Victor stood in his stall, his dark eyes watching her with an intensity that felt almost human. Claire approached him slowly, her hand reaching out to brush against his mane. The warmth of his presence enveloped her, soothing the ache in her chest. "I don't know what to do," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I feel like I'm disappearing, like I'm fading into the background of my own life." Victor remained still, his gaze unwavering. Claire rested her forehead against his neck, tears spilling down her cheeks. The horse didn't move, but his steady presence was enough. It was as if he understood the depths of her pain without judgment, offering her the one thing she craved most, connection. She spent hours in the barn that day, losing herself in the simple rhythm of caring for Victor. She brushed his coat, cleaned his stall, and let the monotony of the tasks quiet the chaos in her mind. But even as she found comfort in the routine, a nagging voice in the back of her mind whispered that something was shifting, that the bond she shared with Victor was becoming something she couldn't explain, something she didn't want to examine too closely. Later that afternoon, Evelyn appeared at the barn, her sharp gaze taking in the scene before her. Claire was kneeling by Victor's stall, her hands covered in hay and dirt, a faint smile playing on her lips. "You've been here a lot lately," Evelyn said, her voice even but probing. Claire looked up, startled. "It's peaceful here," she said quickly, brushing stray strands of hair from her face. "I feel like I can breathe when I'm with him." Evelyn leaned against the doorframe, her arms crossed. "Peaceful, huh?" she said, her tone laced with something Claire couldn't quite place. "Or is it just easier to pour your feelings into a horse than deal with what's really going on?" Claire stiffened, the words cutting deeper than she expected. "I don't know what you mean," she said, her voice defensive. Evelyn didn't respond immediately. She stepped closer, her gaze steady and unrelenting. "I've seen it before," she said finally. People projecting their pain onto something or someone else, thinking it'll fix the emptiness inside them. But it doesn't. It only makes things more complicated. Claire opened her mouth to respond but found herself at a loss for words. Evelyn's insight felt like a mirror reflecting the parts of herself she had been too afraid to confront. That evening, Claire sat alone in the living room, staring at the flickering flames of the fireplace. Mark had retreated to his office again, his absence palpable even when he was just a room away. Claire's thoughts drifted to Victor, to the way he seemed to see her in a way no one else did. She couldn't help but wonder if Evelyn was right. Was she running from the problems in her marriage, using Victor as an emotional crutch? Or was there something deeper at play, something she wasn't ready to face? As the night deepened, Claire found herself standing at the edge of a precipice, caught between the life she had built with Mark and the growing bond she shared with Victor. She knew she couldn't keep straddling the line forever. Sooner or later, she would have to choose, confront the cracks in her marriage or let herself be swept away by the feelings she didn't fully understand. But for now, the shadows of the barn called to her, and Claire knew she would answer. The moon hung low in the inky sky, its pale glow casting silvery light across the fields. The wind carried a faint chill, but Claire barely noticed as she made her way to the barn once again. Each step felt heavier tonight, as if the very ground beneath her feet was trying to resist her. When she pushed open the barn door, the familiar creak echoed into the stillness. Inside, Victor waited as he always did, his dark eyes meeting hers with a quiet intensity. Claire paused, her heart hammering in her chest. There was something different about this night, a tension in the air that seemed to mirror the storm brewing within her. She stepped forward slowly, her boots crunching against the straw-strewn floor. Victor remained motionless, his gaze never leaving hers. Claire reached out, her hand trembling as it brushed against his mane. The warmth of his presence wrapped around her, grounding her in a way that nothing else could. "I don't know who I am anymore," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't even know how I got here." Victor tilted his head slightly, the simple motion carrying a depth of understanding that brought tears to her eyes. Claire leaned against him, her forehead resting on his strong neck. She let the tears fall freely now, her breath hitching as the weight of her loneliness threatened to crush her. The memories came flooding back, unbidden and relentless. She saw herself and Mark in the early days of their marriage, laughing together as they painted the walls of their first home. She remembered the way he used to look at her, his eyes filled with love and promise. But those memories felt like they belonged to someone else, a version of herself that no longer existed. Somewhere along the way, the laughter had faded, replaced by the cold silence that now filled their home. Mark had become a stranger, consumed by his work and oblivious to the growing chasm between them. Claire had tried to reach him, to pull him back into the life they had built together. But every effort was met with indifference, and eventually, she stopped trying. "I feel invisible," she confessed to Victor, her voice breaking. "Like I'm just a shadow in my own life." The horse shifted slightly, his movement steady and deliberate. Claire closed her eyes, letting the rhythm of his breathing calm her frayed nerves. In his presence, she felt seen, heard, and understood in a way that she hadn't felt in years. But as comforting as that thought was, it also terrified her. The door creaked open suddenly, and Claire spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. Evelyn stepped into the barn, her sharp eyes immediately locking onto Claire. "You're here again," Evelyn said, her voice calm but laced with quiet scrutiny. She closed the door behind her, the sound reverberating through the space. Claire straightened, wiping her tears away quickly. "I couldn't sleep," she said, her voice unsteady. Evelyn didn't respond at first. She walked slowly toward Victor, her gaze flickering between the horse and Claire. "You're carrying a lot, aren't you?" she said finally, her tone softer than usual. Claire didn't answer. She looked away, her fingers brushing against the edge of Victor's stall. Evelyn sighed, leaning against the wooden beam. You know, horses like Victor are mirrors, she said. They reflect what's inside of us, even the things we try to hide. That's why you feel so connected to him. Claire looked up sharply, her chest tightening. You don't understand, she said, her voice defensive. Don't I? Evelyn countered, her gaze unwavering. You think I haven't seen this before? You're lonely, Claire. You're searching for something, connection, meaning, escape. And you've found it here, haven't you? Claire's breath caught in her throat. The truth in Evelyn's words cut through her like a blade, leaving her exposed and vulnerable. I don't know what I'm doing, Claire admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I feel like I'm falling apart. Evelyn studied her for a long moment before speaking. Whatever it is you're looking for, you're not going to find it in him, she said, nodding toward Victor. You need to face what's really going on. Otherwise, you'll end up losing more than you realize. The words hung heavy in the air, sinking into Claire's chest like stones. Evelyn's piercing gaze softened slightly, a flicker of understanding crossing her face. You think I don't know what it feels like? Evelyn continued, her voice quieter now. I've been where you are, Claire. I've felt the loneliness, the desperation to feel seen. But trust me when I say this, if you keep going down this path, you'll only hurt yourself. Claire swallowed hard, her throat tight with emotion. She wanted to argue, to defend herself, but she couldn't. Evelyn's words struck too close to home, forcing her to confront the cracks in her carefully constructed facade. That night, as Claire walked back to the house, Evelyn's words echoed in her mind. She knew the horse trainer was right. She was running, hiding from the truth of her own life. But the thought of facing it, of confronting the emptiness that had consumed her marriage, filled her with a fear she couldn't shake. As she climbed into bed beside Mark, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The walls of their room felt suffocating, the silence between them deafening. And for the first time, Claire allowed herself to wonder, could their love be saved, or had it already slipped too far out of reach? The following days passed in a haze for Claire. The tension in her chest never eased, and Evelyn's words remained like an unwelcome guest in her mind. She avoided the barn for a time, afraid of what she might feel when she stood before Victor again. But the pull was always there, like a faint whisper calling her back. Mark was home more often now, though it didn't bring her any comfort. He lingered in his office, caught up in endless Zoom meetings and phone calls, his voice a distant hum behind a closed door. When they crossed paths, their exchanges were brief and mechanical, like strangers cohabiting the same space. One evening, as Claire set the table for dinner, she heard Mark's footsteps behind her. She turned, startled by his presence. It had been days since he had willingly sought her out. You've been quiet lately, Mark said, his tone neutral but tinged with curiosity. Claire hesitated, clutching a plate in her hands. Have I? She replied, her voice light, deflecting. Mark frowned, his eyes narrowing slightly. Is something wrong? The question hit her like a wave, not because of its depth, but because of how late it had come. Months, years even, of building silence between them, and now he asked? The words rose in her throat, sharp and heavy, but she swallowed them down. No, she said instead, forcing a small smile. I'm just tired. Mark studied her for a moment, then nodded as if satisfied with her answer. Me too, he said absently, brushing past her toward the dining table. Claire stood frozen for a moment, the plate trembling in her hands. She wanted to scream, to cry, to demand that he look at her and really see her. But instead, she finished setting the table and sat across from him, eating in silence as the distance between them stretched wider than ever. Later that night, Claire found herself standing at the edge of the field, the barn a dark silhouette against the moonlit sky. She hadn't planned to go there, but her feet had carried her on their own, drawn by an invisible force. When she pushed open the barn door, the familiar scent of hay and earth washed over her, grounding her. Victor was there, as always, his dark eyes meeting hers with a steady gaze that felt like a balm to her aching soul. Claire approached him slowly, her hand reaching out to brush against his mane. "I don't know what I'm doing anymore," she whispered, her voice trembling. Victor remained still, his presence unwavering. Claire closed her eyes, leaning her forehead against his neck. The tears came quickly this time, hot and unrelenting, spilling down her cheeks as her body shook with the weight of her emotions. "I don't know how to fix this," she said, her voice cracking. "I don't even know where to start." The barn door creaked open suddenly, and Claire spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. Evelyn stood in the doorway, her sharp eyes scanning the scene before her. "You're here again," Evelyn said, stepping inside. Her voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that made Claire's stomach tighten. Claire wiped at her tears hastily, turning away. "I needed some air," she said, her voice shaky. Evelyn crossed her arms, leaning against the wooden frame of the stall. "Air, huh?" she said, her tone skeptical. "Or are you just avoiding the truth again?" Claire stiffened, her chest tightening. "Why do you care?" she shot back, her voice louder than she intended. Evelyn didn't flinch. "Because I've seen this before," she said simply. "And I know where it leads." Claire turned to face her, anger and frustration bubbling to the surface. "You don't know anything about me," she snapped. "You have no idea what I've been through." Evelyn's expression softened, a flicker of understanding crossing her face. "You're right," she said quietly. "I don't know everything. But I know what loneliness can do to a person. I know how easy it is to lose yourself in something, or someone, that feels like an escape." The words hit Claire like a punch to the gut, and she felt her anger deflate. Evelyn stepped closer, her gaze steady but not unkind. "You think Victor is the answer to your pain," Evelyn continued, her voice gentle but firm. "But he's not. He's a mirror, Claire. He reflects what's already inside you, the good and the bad. But if you keep looking to him for something he can't give you, you're going to break." Claire's breath hitched, her chest tightening with the weight of Evelyn's words. She turned back to Victor, her hand trembling as it rested on his mane. "I don't know how to stop," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "I feel so lost." Evelyn placed a hand on Claire's shoulder, her touch grounding. "You start by facing it," she said simply. "Whatever it is you're running from, you have to face it. Otherwise, it'll consume you." The barn was silent save for the soft sound of Victor's breathing. Claire stood there, Evelyn's words sinking into her like stones, heavy and unyielding. She knew the horse trainer was right, she couldn't keep running, couldn't keep hiding from the truth of her life. But the thought of confronting it, of facing the cracks in her marriage and the emptiness inside her, felt like standing at the edge of an abyss. That night, as she lay in bed beside Mark, Claire stared at the ceiling, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but one thing was certain, the life she had been living was no longer sustainable. The following morning dawned gray and cold, the sun hidden behind a thick layer of clouds. Claire sat at the kitchen table, her fingers wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. She stared out the window, watching the bare branches sway in the wind, her thoughts a tangled mess. Mark was in the living room, the soft hum of his laptop filling the silence. He had barely spoken to her since last night, though Claire wasn't sure if he even noticed her turmoil. The weight of the unspoken words between them hung heavy in the air, pressing down on her chest like a stone. By mid-afternoon, Claire found herself walking toward the barn again, her resolve both fragile and firm. She pushed open the door and stepped inside, her breath hitching as the familiar scent of hay and earth enveloped her. Victor turned his head toward her, his deep eyes locking onto hers. Claire approached him slowly, her hand reaching out to brush against his mane. The warmth of his presence steadied her, giving her a momentary reprieve from the storm raging inside her. "I don't know what I'm doing," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I keep telling myself I'll figure it out, but I feel like I'm just sinking deeper." The barn door creaked open, and Claire tensed, turning to see Evelyn step inside. The horse trainer's sharp gaze swept over the scene, taking in Claire's tear-streaked face and trembling hands. "You keep coming here," Evelyn said, her voice calm but probing. "Why?" Claire hesitated, her throat tightening. "I don't know," she said finally. "It's the only place I feel like I can breathe." Evelyn stepped closer, her boots crunching softly against the hay-strewn floor. "Or maybe it's the only place you don't have to face what's waiting for you at home," she said, her tone even but pointed. Claire's jaw tightened, her eyes flicking away. "Why does it matter to you?" she snapped, her voice sharp. Evelyn didn't flinch. "Because I've been where you are," she said simply. Claire turned back to her, surprise flickering in her eyes. "What do you mean?" Evelyn leaned against the wooden beam of Victor's stall, her expression softening. "I was married once," she said, her voice quieter now. "And I thought I could fix everything by ignoring the cracks. By finding something, or someone else to fill the void. But it didn't work. It only made things worse." Claire stared at her, the words hitting closer to home than she wanted to admit. "I see the way you look at Victor," Evelyn continued. "And I know what you're feeling. But the truth is, no matter how much you want to escape, the only way to move forward is to face what's holding you back." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with unspoken truths that Claire wasn't ready to confront. Evelyn's words lingered in her mind as she finished her work in the barn and made her way back to the house. That evening, Claire and Mark sat across from each other at the dinner table, the silence between them louder than any words could have been. Claire's hands trembled as she set down her fork, her heart pounding in her chest. "Mark," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He looked up from his plate, his expression neutral but curious. "What's wrong?" Claire hesitated, her throat tightening. She had rehearsed the words in her mind countless times, but now that the moment was here, they felt impossible to say. "I've been feeling distant," she said finally, her voice trembling. "From you. From us." Mark's brow furrowed, confusion flickering across his face. "What do you mean?" Claire took a deep breath, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. "I feel like we've been living separate lives," she said, her voice breaking. "Like we're just coexisting. And I don't know how to fix it." Mark stared at her, his eyes searching hers for a long moment. "Claire, I've been busy with work, but that doesn't mean I don't care," he said, his tone defensive. "It's not just that," Claire said, her voice rising. "It's everything. The way we barely talk, the way we've stopped trying. I feel like I'm disappearing in this marriage, Mark. Like I don't even know who I am anymore." Mark leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Why are you bringing this up now?" he asked, his voice low. Claire's breath hitched, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. "Because I can't keep pretending everything is fine," she said. "It's not. And if we don't face that, we're going to lose everything." The words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. Mark looked away, his jaw tightening as he processed what she had said. "I didn't realize you felt this way," he said finally, his voice quiet. Claire let out a shaky breath, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I didn't want to feel this way," she said. "But I can't keep ignoring it." Mark reached across the table, his hand covering hers. The gesture was small, but it carried a weight that Claire hadn't felt in years. "We'll figure this out," he said, his voice steady. "I don't know how, but we will." Claire nodded, her heart aching with both hope and uncertainty. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like they had taken a step towards something real. Claire woke early the next morning, the faint glow of dawn spilling through the curtains. For the first time in weeks, she didn't feel the familiar weight pressing down on her chest. The conversation with Mark the night before lingered in her mind, tentative, raw, but honest. It wasn't a solution, but it felt like a beginning. Mark had already left the house, his coffee mug rinsed and left by the sink, the faint scent of his cologne still hanging in the air. Claire sat at the table, cradling her own mug, her thoughts tangled. She replayed his words, searching for the sincerity in his voice. Was this a turning point, or just another empty promise? By mid-morning, Claire found herself walking toward the barn, the cold air biting at her skin. The fields stretched out before her, frost glittering on the grass like shards of broken glass. As she approached, the familiar warmth of Victor's presence called to her, steady and unwavering. Pushing open the barn door, she was greeted by the soft sound of hooves shifting in straw. Victor lifted his head, his dark eyes locking onto hers. Claire exhaled slowly, stepping inside. I had a long talk with Mark last night, she said aloud, her voice soft. It's a start, I think. But I don't know if it's enough. Victor watched her silently, his gaze calm and steady. Claire reached out, running her fingers through his mane, the warmth of his coat grounding her. You've been my anchor, she whispered. I don't know how I'd have made it through without you. The sound of the barn door opening startled her, and Claire turned sharply. Evelyn stepped inside, her sharp gaze sweeping over the scene. You're here again, Evelyn said, her tone neutral but curious. Claire straightened, brushing her hands against her jeans. I guess I've been spending a lot of time here, she admitted. Evelyn stepped closer, her boots crunching softly against the straw. You had that look again, she said, leaning against the wooden stall door. Like you're searching for something. Claire hesitated, her chest tightening. I don't know what I'm looking for, she said finally. Evelyn tilted her head, studying her. Maybe you're not looking for anything. Maybe you're trying to escape. The words struck a nerve, and Claire looked away, her hand tightening on Victor's mane. Escaping doesn't fix anything, Evelyn continued, her voice softer now. Trust me. I've tried. Claire turned back to her, curiosity flickering in her eyes. You've never told me much about yourself, she said, her voice tentative. Evelyn shrugged, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her lips. Not much to tell, she said. I was married once. Thought we'd grow old together, build a life worth remembering. But somewhere along the way, we stopped seeing each other. Claire's breath hitched, the parallel to her own life hitting too close to home. What happened? Evelyn's gaze turned distant, her voice tinged with sadness. I looked for connection elsewhere. It wasn't physical, but it didn't need to be. The damage was the same. She paused, exhaling slowly. By the time I realized what I'd done, it was too late. We'd both drifted too far apart to find our way back. The barn fell silent, the weight of Evelyn's confession settling heavily between them. Claire's mind raced, Evelyn's story stirring a deep unease within her. You're lucky, Evelyn said finally, her gaze meeting Claire's. You still have a chance. Don't waste it. Claire swallowed hard, her throat tight with emotion. I don't know if I can fix it, she admitted. Evelyn's expression softened. You won't know unless you try. The words lingered in Claire's mind as Evelyn left the barn, her figure silhouetted against the pale light of the open door. Claire turned back to Victor, her hand resting on his mane. I don't know what I'm doing, she whispered, her voice trembling. But I think she's right. I have to try. Later that evening, Claire stood in the kitchen, her hands trembling as she prepared dinner. Mark was due home any minute, and her nerves felt like a live wire. She replayed Evelyn's words over and over, bracing herself for the conversation she knew had to happen. When the door opened and Mark stepped inside, his face lit up in surprise at the sight of her waiting. "Dinner smells great," he said, setting his bag down. Claire forced a smile, her heart pounding. "Thanks," she said, her voice unsteady. They ate in relative silence, the clinking of cutlery the only sound between them. When Mark finally set his fork down and looked at her, Claire felt her breath catch. "Claire, I've been thinking about what you said last night," he began, his voice careful. "You're right. Things haven't been the way they should be." Claire's chest tightened, her hands clutching the edge of the table. "I don't know how we got here," she admitted, her voice breaking. "But I miss what we used to have, Mark. I miss us." Mark's expression softened, guilt flickering in his eyes. "I do too," he said. "And I don't want to lose you." The words hit Claire like a wave, and she felt tears well up in her eyes. For the first time in what felt like forever, she saw a glimmer of the man she had fallen in love with. "It's not going to be easy," she said, her voice trembling. Mark nodded, reaching across the table to take her hand. "I know. But I'm willing to try if you are." In that moment, Claire felt a spark of hope, fragile but real. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like they were on it together. The days that followed felt like a cautious thaw after a long, bitter winter. Claire and Mark began to rediscover the pieces of themselves they had hidden away, pieces that had once made them inseparable. But the change was tentative, like walking on thin ice, every step taken with both hope and fear. Mark made an effort to leave his office earlier, setting aside his work to sit with Claire in the evenings. They didn't talk about everything at once, it was too raw, too overwhelming, but they talked. For the first time in years, the silence between them wasn't cold or distant, it felt like space to heal. One crisp afternoon, as the sun dipped low in the sky, Claire stood in the barn brushing Victor's coat. The repetitive motion of the brush in her hand was soothing, almost meditative. Victor, as always, stood still, his dark eyes calm and steady. "You've been my escape," she murmured softly, her voice carrying the weight of an unspoken goodbye. "I don't think I would have made it through without you." The sound of footsteps on the gravel outside made her turn. Mark was standing in the open barn door, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. His presence was unexpected, he rarely ventured out to the barn. "Hey," he said, his voice tentative. "Hey," Claire replied, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. "What are you doing out here?" Mark stepped inside, glancing around the barn as if seeing it for the first time. "I realized I've never really spent time here," he said, his tone almost apologetic. Claire watched him as he approached Victor, his movements careful and unsure. He reached out hesitantly, his hand brushing the horse's neck. Victor tilted his head slightly, accepting the touch. "I can see why you come here," Mark said after a moment, his gaze lingering on Victor. "He's steady. Strong." Claire's throat tightened. She turned away, focusing on the brush in her hand. "He's been my constant," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark looked at her then, his expression filled with something she hadn't seen in years, understanding. "I think I've been so focused on everything outside of us," he said, his voice soft. "Work, success, whatever I thought I needed to provide. But I stopped seeing you, Claire. And that's on me." The words hit her like a wave, and she struggled to steady her breath. "I stopped trying too," she confessed. "I let the silence grow between us because it felt easier than fighting for something that felt gone." Mark stepped closer, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "It's not gone," he said firmly. "We just lost it for a while. But I think we can find it again." Claire looked up at him, her eyes glistening with tears. For a moment, the barn felt warmer, the air lighter. She nodded, a faint smile breaking through her emotion. "I want to try," she said, her voice steady. They stood together in the quiet barn, the weight of their unspoken promises filling the space between them. Later that evening, as they sat together in the living room, Mark reached for her hand, intertwining his fingers with hers. The gesture was small, but it carried a significance that spoke volumes. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice low. "Maybe we need to take some time away. Just us. Somewhere quiet." Claire tilted her head, curiosity flickering in her eyes. "You mean like a trip?" Mark nodded. "Yeah. Just a few days. We can leave the noise behind for a while and focus on us." The idea felt both exciting and terrifying. They hadn't spent uninterrupted time together in years, and the thought of peeling back all the layers they had buried was daunting. But Claire knew he was right, they needed a fresh start, even if it was just a small one. "Okay," she said, her voice soft but resolute. "Let's do it." The next few days were a whirlwind of quiet planning and cautious optimism. Claire found herself smiling more, the heaviness in her chest lifting ever so slightly. Even Evelyn noticed the change when Claire mentioned the trip during a brief conversation in the barn. "That's good," Evelyn said, her voice steady but approving. "You're doing the right thing." Claire nodded, feeling a flicker of gratitude for the woman who had pushed her to face the truth. "Thank you," she said quietly. Evelyn's gaze softened. "Don't thank me," she said. "Just make it count." On the morning of their departure, Claire stood in the barn one last time before they left. Victor watched her with his usual calm, his dark eyes filled with quiet understanding. "You've been my refuge," she said softly, stroking his mane. "But I think I'm ready to stop hiding." Victor remained still, his presence as steady as ever. Claire stepped back, her chest tight with emotion. "I'll be back," she promised, her voice steady. "But not because I'm running anymore." As she walked out of the barn, the crisp morning air filled her lungs, and for the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of clarity. Mark was waiting by the car, his expression warm and open. Claire met his gaze and smiled, the weight of her burdens lifting just a little more. As they drove away, the barn faded into the distance, but Claire didn't feel the same pull she once had. Instead, she felt something new, hope. The drive was quiet but comfortable, the tension that had once defined their silences replaced with something softer. The countryside stretched out before them, golden fields and rolling hills bathed in the soft light of late morning. Claire glanced at Mark, his hand steady on the wheel, his profile illuminated by the glow of the sun. She couldn't remember the last time they'd done something like this, just the two of them, no distractions, no looming responsibilities. It felt both strange and long overdue. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice light but tinged with curiosity. Mark smiled faintly, keeping his eyes on the road. "It's a surprise," he said. "Nothing fancy, just somewhere quiet." Claire nodded, her heart fluttering with a mix of anticipation and unease. She turned her gaze back to the window, watching the scenery blur past. They arrived at a small, rustic cabin nestled at the edge of a forest, its wooden beams weathered by time and the elements. A thin plume of smoke curled from the chimney, and the faint scent of pine hung in the crisp air. Mark carried their bags inside while Claire lingered by the car, taking in the serene surroundings. The sound of birds chirping and the gentle rustle of leaves in the wind felt almost foreign after the chaos of their everyday lives. When she stepped inside, the warmth of the cabin embraced her. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. The space was simple but inviting, a cozy retreat that seemed to promise respite from the noise of the world. Mark set the bags down and turned to her, his expression cautious but hopeful. "What do you think?" Claire smiled, her chest tightening. "It's perfect," she said, her voice soft. That evening, they sat together by the fire, the flickering flames casting a warm glow over the room. Mark poured them each a glass of wine, the rich aroma mingling with the scent of burning wood. Claire swirled the glass in her hand, her gaze fixed on the flames. "It's been a long time since we did something like this," she said quietly. Mark nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Too long," he admitted. "I guess I got so caught up in everything else that I forgot how important this is." Claire looked at him, her heart aching with the weight of all the years they had lost. "I forgot too," she said. "I let the distance between us grow because I didn't know how to close it." Mark reached for her hand, his touch warm and steady. "We're here now," he said. "And I don't want to waste any more time." The sincerity in his voice brought tears to Claire's eyes. She squeezed his hand, a flicker of hope sparking to life in her chest. The next few days were filled with quiet moments of reconnection. They hiked through the forest, their steps crunching against the carpet of fallen leaves. They cooked meals together in the small kitchen, laughing as they navigated the cramped space. One afternoon, as they sat by the lake near the cabin, Mark turned to Claire, his expression serious. "Can I ask you something?" Claire nodded, her chest tightening. "Of course." Mark hesitated, his gaze flicking to the water. "Do you think we can get back to where we were? Before everything got complicated?" Claire took a deep breath, her thoughts swirling. "I don't think we can go back," she said honestly. "But maybe that's not what we need. Maybe we can find something new, something better." Mark studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "I like that idea," he said, a small smile tugging at his lips. On their last night at the cabin, they sat by the fire again, the warmth wrapping around them like a blanket. Claire rested her head on Mark's shoulder, her heart full in a way it hadn't been in years. "I've missed this," she said softly. "Me too," Mark replied, his voice steady. As the fire crackled and the stars twinkled outside, Claire felt a fragile but undeniable hope take root within her. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, she felt like they were ready to walk it together. The drive back home was quiet but filled with a sense of newfound purpose. As they approached the house, Claire felt a mix of emotions, relief, anticipation, and a lingering fear of falling back into old patterns. But she pushed the fear aside, focusing instead on the progress they had made. When they pulled into the driveway, Claire glanced toward the barn. It stood silent and still, the familiar silhouette a reminder of how far she had come. Later that evening, as she stood in the barn brushing Victor's coat, Claire felt a deep sense of gratitude for the role he had played in her journey. "You've been my strength," she said softly. "But it's time for me to stand on my own now." Victor nickered softly, his dark eyes steady and calm. Claire smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek. As she walked back to the house, the cool night air wrapped around her like a gentle embrace. Mark was waiting for her on the porch, his figure silhouetted against the warm glow of the house. Claire stepped into the circle of his arms, resting her head against his chest. For the first time in years, she felt like she was home, not just in the house, but in his presence. Together, they stood under the stars, ready to face whatever came next. What did you think of this story? If you enjoyed the story, let us know. Your feedback means the world and helps us bring more stories like this to life. And of course, we want to apologize for any mistakes or imperfections along the way. If you noticed anything that could be improved, please share it in the comments too. It's your input that helps this channel grow and become better. Thank you so much for being here and taking the time to listen. We can't wait to hear from you.